أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق أجمعين سيدنا محمد عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أفضل الصلاة والتسليم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا وعملا صالحا متقبلا ورزقا حلالا طيبا يا أكرم الأكرمين وبعد. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the beneficial knowledge. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bestow His blessings upon all of us, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the right fear from His punishment and the positive hope in His reward. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to shower us with His mercy in this life and in the hereafter, inshallah. This is the third class out of 4 covering the hereafter, or Darul Akhirah, or what happens after life. The first class we talked about what happened before and during death, the meaning of death and what happens to the human body and soul when death comes. And then the last class we talked about what exactly happens when the soul is leaving the body. And then what happens afterwards until the person is put in the grave, and then the angels of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come to him and question him in the grave. So we talked about the death, and then the departure of the soul from the body, and then the timeline of the events that happen in the grave, starting from the ultimate awakening, as we call it, to the squeeze of the grave, to the questions by the angels of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then to the presentations of the deeds, and then the reveal of the person's place in Jannah or in the Nar. And we thought about each one of them in a kind of detail. And then after that, the last point we were talking about was about Adab al-Qabri wa Na'im al-Qabr, the pleasure that happens to the person in the grave if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed this for him, and the punishment or the torment that happens to him if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills that for him. And I remember we concluded with the argument that some people are trying to make that there is no such a thing that is called the punishment of the grave. And they said it is not mentioned in the Quran. There is no clear-cut ayah in the Quran that is saying that people will be punished in a certain way in the grave. And then we discussed that this is against almost the consensus of Muslims all over history. And not just that, there is actually an ayah in the Quran that implies the fact that people might be actually punished in the grave. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about the people of Fir'aun, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, النار يعرضون عليها غدوا وعشيا ويوم تقوم الساعة أدخلوا آل فرعون أشد العذاب. And this is the translation of the ayah. Plus, it is not rationally something impossible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might punish people in the grave. So the punishment in the grave, it happens to everyone that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills to punish. That includes the unbelievers, the people who never believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that includes the sinful people or the sinners who committed sins and violated the commands and the prohibitions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It happens to this ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it happens to all the ummah or all the nations that came before us. And the punishment in the grave is of 2 different sorts. The first one, we call it the permanent punishment, the permanent torment. That may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save all of us, that happens to the person from the moment he's put in the grave all the way until the day of judgment. It never stops. It's continuous. It's ongoing adab or punishment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for some other people, and that depends of course on the deeds of the person. For some other people, the adab will be like every now and then. It depends on what the person did in his life or in her life. That sometimes he's punished, sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might alleviate that punishment from this person, so it is not continuous or permanent until the day of judgment. The word adab in Arabic language, which we translate it to be the punishment or the torment, the word adab, it's originally derived from the word daraba, which means to hit. So there is a relation between adaba wa daraba. So you have these 2 different verbs in Arabic language, to punish someone or to hit someone or to beat someone. So they both are very related in terms of the linguistic derivations of these two words. And then the word adab, again, which we translate as punishment, became used more commonly in anything that includes a very severe punishment. في كل عقوبة مؤلمة. Anything that causes a lot of pain, we call it adab. We call it torture. So it became a very specific type or meaning, aside from the original derivation that is coming from the word daraba, or hit. And there are multiple sorts or kinds of the punishment in the grave. One of it we mentioned already last week, that the squeeze of the grave that crushes the body of the person. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may cause the grave to squeeze the person until, as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, حَتَّى تَخْتَلِفَ أَضْلَاعُهُ, until the grave would crush the limbs or the body parts of the person. Some hadith that talk about the punishment in the grave is the hadith that are talking about some sort of snakes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends for the person in the grave. Some hadith use the word snakes, and some hadith use the word that we can literally translate to be serpents, or as we call it in our language, dragons. So some hadith use this word of dragons that imply to a huge snake that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to a person. And under this hadith, even though there is some sort of disagreement over the authenticity of the hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, يُسَلِّطُ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْكَافِرِ فِي قَبْرِهِ 99 تنينا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to the unbeliever in his grave 99 giant dragons or huge snakes. One of the reasons the scholar said this hadith is problematic in terms of the chain of narrators is because the hadith was reported in multiple different numbers. Some narrations said 99, some narrations said 70, some narrations said more or less numbers. But the meaning of the hadith itself, about the fact that there are kind of snakes, again, when we say snakes, of course we have a similar like creature that we call a snake in our world, but that type of creature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send there will not be exactly the same. It will be actually much worse in looking and in the way they are scary. The way they are scary. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that these 99 serpents will keep punishing this person, will keep constricting this person, will keep heading this person until the day of judgment. And then he said, if one of those serpents or dragons or snakes is just one of them out of the 99 would hiss on the earth, that would be enough that this earth will never grow any kind of plants. If only one of those serpents or snakes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends on the person. Last time we said some people will be exempted from the from the question of the grave. Whoever was exempted from the questions of the angels would of course be exempted from the punishment or the torture of the grave. Sometimes there are traditions that are talking about scorpions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send to the grave of the person. Sometimes it's burning, that the grave itself is burning with the person inside of it. Sometimes with the angels themselves hitting the person or beating the person or torturing the person, as we said last time, when the person cannot answer the question, who is your Lord and what is your religion and what do you say about the man that was sent to you, the angel would hit him with this huge hammer that he had, as we said in the hadith last time, until this person screams in the loudest of his voice that every single creature, every single living creature is able to listen to his or her scream, except for the jinn of mankind, as the Prophet ﷺ said. While in the other side, which is again one of two different scenarios, as the Prophet ﷺ said, رَوْضَةٌ مِّن رِيَاضِ الْجَنَّةِ أَوْ حُفْرَةٌ مِّن حُفَرِ النَّارِ. It's whether a garden from the gardens of the Jannah or a pit from the pits of the fire. So the other scenario, if a person that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with and he has passed that test of the questions of the angels, so the angels would actually spread a kind of a bed or a big mattress for him in the grave that is coming from the Jannah. يُفْرَشُ لَهُ مِنْ فِرَاشِ الْجَنَّةِ. And they would grant him clothes that the people of the Jannah wear. وَيُلْبَسُ مِنْ لِبَاسِ الْجَنَّةِ. And there will be a kind of a gate or a door in his grave that leads directly to the Jannah, so he can see the Jannah and have a kind of an access to the Jannah all the time. He's not going to enter the Jannah typically as is going to happen in the day of judgment, but he has a kind or she has a kind of an access to the Jannah. So he or she can smell the smell of the Jannah. He can see, or she can see the blessings and the bounties in the Jannah. The qabr will be very widened and very broad for him. يُفْسَحُ لَهُ فِي قَبْرِهِ, as the Prophet ﷺ also said. And all the time the angels are giving him glad tidings that this is what is waiting for you in the Jannah. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preparing for you. He would see, as we said last time, that was you placed in the hellfire, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has replaced it for you with a place in the Jannah. The qabr will be lightened. It's not going to be dark for this person. All these different types of pleasures, of blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the person will be enjoying in his grave or in her grave. In the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there are multiple kinds of dhikr, Quran and other things that a person is really highly recommended to do or perform, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might save him or protect him from the fitna and the punishment of the grave. And remember, I think I said one surah in the Quran that is very important to recite, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would save you inshallah from the punishment of the grave if you recite it. Which surah is this? Surah Al-Mulk, Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to call it al-waqiyah, the protector, or al-munjiyah, which is almost the same meaning, or the saver. And there's a beautiful story that happened that Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas reported. He said one of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam has pitched his tent over a grave, but he didn't know that he has put it on a grave. So he was just randomly going somewhere. He wanted to rest, so that the Arabs, the Bedouins, would do that. So he pitched his tent and he just rested there. He slept his night in that tent, but there was a grave right under the tent, and this Sahabi didn't notice about this. And then the Sahabi, during the night, he heard a voice of a person who was reciting Surah Al-Mulk. And he didn't know where is this sound coming from. He tried to check multiple times. He doesn't know who is reciting. There is no one literally around the tent. But he kept hearing the recitation of Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk. And he said the entire surah, hatta khatama, until he concluded, that person concluded the entire surah. So when he got up in the morning, he realized that he was actually sleeping in this tent over or above a grave. So he went back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said, Ya Rasulullah, ضربت خبائي على قبر وأنا لا أحسب أنه قبر. He said, I have pitched my tent over a grave, but I didn't know actually that was a grave. And then he said, so I heard a voice coming out from this grave, from underground, of a person who was actually reciting or reading Surah Al-Mulk. So the Prophet ﷺ said, Hiya al-mani'a. It's the defender. Hiya al-munjiya. It's the protector. It's the deliverer. Tunjihi min adhab al-qabr. Said this surah delivers the person from the punishment of the grave, or saves the person from the punishment of the grave. In another different hadith, he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَدِدْتُ أَنَّ تَبَارَكَ الَّذِي بِيَدِهِ الْمُلْكِ فِي قَلْبِ كُلِّ مُؤْمِنٍ. One of the names of the surah is تَبَارَكَ الَّذِي بِيَدِهِ الْمُلْكِ, which is the beginning of the surah. So he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, I wish if the surah of Al-Mulk is in the heart of every single Muslim, for how important and significant the surah is. So there are multiple ahadith about the surah. Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu anhu said, and this is a narration from him, not from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said that when a person is put in the grave, and then the angels of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come to test him in the grave, and then he said if they are trying to scare him or to punish him, and one of them would come from his legs, from the side of his legs, he said his legs will actually speak and would say, لَيْسَ لَكُمْ عَلَيْهِ سَبِيلٌ. You have nothing to do with him. So the legs will be defending the person. You have nothing to do with him. He used to stand on me praying Qiyamul Layl and reciting Surah Al-Mulk. Specifically, particularly in Qiyamul Layl, that the person was reciting Surah Al-Mulk. And then they said, so the angel would try to come from the other side, from the head, try to capture the person. And then his tongue will speak even without this person being willing to do this, and would say, لَيْسَ لَكُمْ عَلَيْهِ سَبِيلٌ. You have nothing to do with him, because he used to recite Al-Mulk with this tongue, and would defend that person from the punishment of the angel. And then Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu comments on this, and he says, هِيَ الْمَانِعَةُ مِنْ عَذَابِ اللَّهِ. It's the protector and the saver from the punishment of Allah. And he referenced that it's actually mentioned in some other divine books, like in the Torah of Musa alayhi salam, there was a reference of something similar to Surah Al-Mulk. Then he said, "Man qara'aha fi laylatin faqad akthara wa atyab." Whoever recites it in every night, that means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has offered this person with with all the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The entire course was supposed to cover 4 main aspects. Just to remind you with this slide again about the timeline of the events that would happen from after death all the way until Al-Jannah or the Hellfire. So we talked about death, and then we talked about the grave, and we talked about shortly about the punishment or the reward or the blessings of the grave. And then the person stays there in the same conditions until the day of resurrection. Until 2 things happen, which we call them the resurrection and the gathering, which are 2 sequent events that would happen. And there is a certain timeline that is actually not a matter of consensus among the scholars, like how these things will happen, or what is the exact time order of these things. So this order that is in this slide is what is considered by so many scholars. It's not a consensus, but majority of the scholars have considered this order to be the exact order that would happen. That once Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala resurrects people back to life, then there will be the day of gathering, so everybody will be gathered in a certain place. The first thing, so starting from here, there is a kind of a debate or dispute among the scholars, how can we order these things time-wise? So some people would say, some scholars would say that the first thing after the gathering, after the hashr, would be the hawd of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You might find some other implications in different hadith that the hawd would come later. But again, this is what I choose, that I found is kind of chosen or preferred by so many different scholars who talked about this topic. So resurrection, which we call it an-nashr, and the Quran calls it an-nashr or an-nushur, which means resurrection or resurrecting people back to life from their graves or after death. And then al-hashr, which both words are almost very similar in pronunciation in Arabic, but they're 2 different meanings. And al-hashr means the gathering, because after you are resurrected, you'll be gathered in a certain place. And there is a surah in the Quran that is called al-hashr, the surah of gathering. Then after al-hashr, that takes very long time, there will be the hawd or the basin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then after that, there will be the intercession or the shafa'ah. And there are multiple different kinds of the shafa'ah, which is the major one is the shafa'ah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Shafa'ah means that he would intercede with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on our behalf. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, wills this for us. Then after that, there will be the presentation of your deeds and actions. Ardul a'mal, that everyone would see in front of his eyes or her eyes whatever he or she did in their lives. And then the hisab, the reckoning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that everyone will be held accountable, and then people will be started to be asked about their actions. And then the scale, the mizan, that you would see actually your deeds and your action shaped in a certain way and put in an actual scale, as mentioned a lot in the Quran. Then after that comes the bridge, and again you'll find some other tradition that the bridge comes earlier than this. But the bridge, which is the sirat, comes almost towards the end according to this narrative. It comes almost towards the end, which is the sirat that everyone has to cross. And then the last thing, people will be admitted, whether in the Jannah or in the hellfire. So basically the course is supposed to cover all of these things. They sound as so many different things, and they are. And we're just starting to talk about the resurrection and how people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will resurrect them after life. We'll try to go over as much as we can, because next week will be the conclusion of the class, inshallah. So we'll try to go over as much as we can to give a bit of a summary of the major events that would happen, starting from the Day of Judgment. What happens when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes people to come back to life, which is a very major theme in the Quran. The Quran talks about resurrection so much. When we study or we think or read about Aqidah, there are so many different topics in Aqidah, but the most repeated topic in Aqidah in the Quran is the Hashr and Nashr, is this concept of resurrection and the gathering. And the main problem the people of Mecca had with the Prophet ﷺ, the main reason they denied his da'wah was because of the resurrection. All the time they're denying this. They didn't have problem with the oneness of Allah, or even though the meaning of what they believed in contradicts the concept of the oneness of Allah, but they can have a sort of oneness in their minds at least. And they didn't have a problem of denying the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. Their main problem was the fact that people might come back to life after they die. If you look at the Mecca Quran specifically, a major theme in the Mecca Quran, the Quran was revealed in Mecca, it's all talking about Yawm al-Qiyamah, the day of judgment or the day of resurrection. And they always come to the Prophet ﷺ and say, how come after we become dust and bones, Allah would return us back to life? And this ayah is mentioned in the Quran like 4 or 5 times, almost in the same words. أَإِذَا كُنَّا عِظَامًا وَتُرَابًا. After we became dust and bones, you think or you believe or you want us to believe that we will be returned back to life. And always Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is offering the Quran multiple arguments about this. He would tell them, قُلْ يُحْيِيهَا الَّذِي أَنْشَأَهَا أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ. And the simplest argument the Quran mentioned about this is that if you believe that He created you at the beginning, why is it a big deal that He's able to bring you back to life? Which is more great to believe in? If you believe that you are created and you are designed and you were created from nothing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought you from complete non-existence to an actual existence, then the fact that He's able to bring you back to life is actually much easier for Him. That's why the Quran would say, وَهُوَ أَهْوَنُ عَلَيْهِ. It's very easy for Him, which means for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because if He brought you at the beginning to this life, it's very easy for Him to bring you back to life after you die. So this is the simplest and the most common argument in the Quran. That if you have a problem with the resurrection, then you have a problem with the creation to begin with. So you need to double check your understanding of your creation or khalq by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then you can argue about the resurrection. قُلْ يُحْيِيهَا الَّذِي أَنْشَأَهَا أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ وَهُوَ بِكُلِّ خَلْقٍ عَلِيمٌ. And this ayah is mentioned in which surah? Yasin. Okay, it's in the slides, right? Okay. So it's mentioned in Surah Yasin, which is a beautiful surah, and it's related to death because we know that Surah Yasin, the Prophet ﷺ said, اقرأوها على موتاكم. You recite it to the people who are dying among you. And the main sunnah is to recite it to a person who is dying. He's not dead yet, right? If he died already or she died already, you still can read the Quran for him, which is a matter of ikhtilaf among the scholars, but you can read the Quran for general for the dead person with the intention that the thawab of your recitation would go to that person, which is not a problem. But the hadith that says read it to the people who are dying means, or literally it means read it to the dead people, doesn't mean the people who died already. It means the people who are dying. If you are anticipating or thinking this person is going to die soon, it's a sunnah to recite Surah Yasin in front of this person. And the reason that we recite Surah Yasin specifically is that Surah Yasin has the major principles of Aqeedah, and specifically the principle of the Day of Judgment and the Day of Resurrection. It talks about the Day of Judgment and it incorporates the argument for the Day of Judgment among so many different other stories of ancient peoples, and talking about some different creatures of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of plants and animals and orbits and sun and the moon and all these different creatures. The surah adds the theme of the Day of Judgment in the middle of all of these different meanings and themes in the most brilliant way. It starts with an introduction talking about the Quran, then it talks about the story of the people of Yasin, which was a name of a person, or a name of a group of people. Then it talks about some different creatures of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then it would talk about death, and then it would come back to talk about a different story, and then it would talk about some sorts of rewards and punishment on Yawm al-Qiyamah, and then it would talk back again about the resurrection. So the theme of Yawm al-Qiyamah is planted in Surah Yasin in a very beautiful way. So the surah has all these different major principles of Aqeedah in general. And Imam al-Ghazali commented on the themes of Surah Yasin in general, and he said, because the part of the core essence of your iman is to believe in the resurrection and the gathering. He said, your iman is not full. It doesn't have any value, basically, in Islam if you do not believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would return you back to life. So this is maybe one of the reasons why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam recommended that we read it to the people who are dying. And the reason that some Salaf called it Qalb al-Quran, and it's actually a hadith reported from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's the heart of the Quran. He said, "Inna li kulli shay'in qalban wa qalbu al-Quran yasin." Everything has a heart, and the heart of the Quran is Yasin. So people would be resurrected, would come back to life, regardless of those people who were in a grave or regardless of the way those people died or lost their lives. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would return them back to life. And regardless of their situation in the grave itself, some people would vanish completely. Some people would become literally just dust and bones, as those people said. Some people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would preserve their bodies. like the prophets and the martyrs, the shuhada, and so many different kinds of people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would will that those people the body will not eat, as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, لا تأكل الأرض أجسادها. The body and all these factors that dissolve the human body after a long time under the ground in the grave, some people would be preserved and would be protected from this. Mainly the prophets and the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and secondly, the people who died in the battlefield for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then some scholars quoted some different traditions and hadith, or mostly traditions from the Salaf. They said that the person was committed to the Quran most of his life or all of his life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would preserve his body. The person, the mu'adhin, the one who raises the adhan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserves his body from in the grave until the day of judgment. Even though some scholars mentioned, they said the person who loves his brother in Islam or sister in Islam for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the Prophet ﷺ said that al-mahabbatu fillah, if you love someone for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is really not easy, because we claim it all the time, I love you for the sake of Allah, but it's actually not easy thing to claim. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said those people would be offered the shade of the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you think of this person among the other 7 or 6 people that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned to be given the shade of the throne in this very hard day, you think, okay, like he actually didn't really, or she didn't really do a lot of things by just loving a person. But the hadith is specific. لا يحبه إلا لله. He or she does not love that person except for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To have this very high level of love refined completely, that you have no interest in anything other than just loving this person for the sake of Allah, then you deserve what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam promised of the shade of Allah, and you might, Allahu a'lam, you might deserve the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve your body. The person who makes a lot of dhikr in his life, maybe that will be from the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserves in their bodies in the grave. There is a long theological debate about how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala resurrect or bring people back to life? And does the body vanish completely and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reconstruct the entire body completely from nothing? Or do you be little parts of the body left and then this part will be developed and evolved into the body again? We really do not care so much about these things, but what we believe in is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala return us back to life. From Adam Mahd, from a complete Adam, non-existence, like again exactly as the first time, and that was one opinion because the ayah almost says something like this, الَّذِي أَنْشَأَهَا أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ. Or some other scholars said from tafriq, which means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gathers the scattered components of the body again and just shapes them together. It wouldn't really make a lot of difference for us. We believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bring us back to life. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would force everybody to be gathered in one place. And the word hashr in the Quran is very common. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي إِلَيْهِ تُحْشَرُونَ. And fear Allah, to whom you will be gathered. And we have the word hashr, which is gathering, and al-mahshar, which is the place of gathering. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, وَحَشَرْنَاهُمْ فَلَمْ نُغَادِرْ مِنْهُمْ أَحَدًا. And we will gather them and not leave behind from them anyone. Every single person. And not only person, by the way. All creatures and all living beings will be gathered, even animals. Every single living being Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created will be gathered in one place. The first person that the earth will be splitted for this person to emerge or to come up or to leave the grave will be the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Will be the first one to be resurrected and leave from his grave. And then his 2 best companions, Abu Bakr and Umar, who were buried next to him. And then the people in the grave of Al-Baqiyah. Did any one of you visit Medina before? The grave of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and still people are buried there next to the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ. May Allah grant all of you a visit to the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ. Ashab al-Baqiyah, whoever was buried in Al-Baqiyah would be next in terms of their resurrection and coming back to life. And then it will be one shout, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنَّمَا هِيَ زَجْرَةٌ وَاحِدَةٌ. Only one loud shout. فَإِذَا هُمْ بِالسَّاهِرَةِ. And suddenly they will be alert upon the earth, the surface of the earth. And there are multiple opinions about the meaning of as-sahira. Some scholars said it's just like the surface of the earth, so people would come out from the graves. And some people said it's actually a different earth that we've never seen in our lives. It is not the same earth that we are living on now. And how did they get this opinion? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَوْمَ تُبَدَّلُ الْأَرْضُ غَيْرَ الْأَرْضِ. on this day the earth will be replaced by another earth. So they said maybe it's a different earth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would create, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will turn the earth upside down. It will be a different scenery that we've never seen in our life. And there's a lot of traditions that say the place of mahshar, if we want to locate it in this planet that we're living in, the place of gathering for the human beings will be in Asham. And there's a lot of Sahih traditions that are talking about this, somewhere in the Great Syria area. In this entire region of Asham, it will be there. And some people will specify it specifically in Bayt al-Maqdis, close to Al-Majlis al-Aqsa. That is the place where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would gather everyone there. And again, everyone, people, animals, jinn, all the creatures of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But people are going to that place, are being forced to go to that place in different states. They're not the same. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, يُحْشَرُ النَّاسُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ ثَلَاثَةَ أَصْنَافٍ, that the people will be gathered in three classes on the day of resurrection. صِنْفًا مُشَاةً, a class of them walking. وَصِنْفًا رُكْبَانًا, and a class of them riding, whatever the thing they're riding. And then he said, which is so scary, وَصِنْفًا عَلَى وُجُوهِهِمْ, and a class of people upon their faces. So the Sahaba asked the very common sense question. They said, Ya Rasulullah, how come one person walks on his face? How can we walk on our faces? Like walking, riding, we understand that. But how can a person walk on his face, on her face? Ya Rasulullah, وَكَيْفَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى وُجُوهِهِمْ. So he responded with a very simple and logical response, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He said, the one who enabled them in this life to walk on their feet is the same one who is able to make them, or to enable them to walk on their faces on this day. If you believe in the same Lord, why were you created to walk on your feet? It is not something that you had to be designed like this. He willed your shape to be in this way. If He willed you at the beginning, when He created us as human beings from the beginning, to be creatures who walk on our faces, He could have done that. If He willed that we would be creatures who walk on our hands, He would have decreed that subhanahu wa ta'ala, but He did not. So لا يعجزه شيء. There is nothing that is hard for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make. And then He said sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, أَمَا إِنَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ بِوُجُوهِهِمْ كُلَّ حَدَبٍ وَشَوْكٍ. He's emphasized that this will happen, and those people will try to protect their faces from every pump and throw. Those people are walking on their faces, trying to protect their faces from the evil that is on the earth. And even the shapes of the human beings are being gathered in different shapes. Some of them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will gather them in the shape of monkeys. And those who are the people who used to commit zina in this life. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save all of us. Some people would be gathered in the shape of pigs. Those are the people who used to devour haram money in their lives. Whatever unlawful gains of money these people used to make in this life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would gather them in the shape of pigs. Some people would be gathered blind. And the hadith said it's every person who had a kind of authority and he was unjust using his authority or her authority. في كل حاكم جائر. Everyone had authority, whatever major or minor authority, and this person was abusing the authority and causing people injustice. This person will be gathered blind on the day of judgment. That's why you can tell on this, when everybody is gathered, you can see what is happening. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُعْرَفُ الْمُجْرِمُونَ بِسِيمَاهُمْ. The criminals on this day will be known by their marks. فَيُؤْخَذُ بِالنَّوَاصِي وَالْأَقْدَامِ. And they will be seized by forelocks and the feet. And he said, وَنَحْشُرُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ يَوْمَئِذٍ زُرْقًا. We would gather the criminals on this day with blue faces. And he said, يَوْمَ تَبْيَضُّ وُجُوهٌ وَتَسْوَدُّ وُجُوهٌ. Some faces will be white and some faces will be black. And he's not talking about the color of the skin. It's about the light and the darkness. Right? It has nothing to do with the color of our skins. It's talking about that people would be having signs of the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or people who are having signs of the ghadab or the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After everyone is gathered, people would beg that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishes and starts the day of judgment. Because it's a very long time. And people are very scared, and very tense, and very worried. Every single one. Very few people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reassure and calm their hearts down. And people are waiting for Allahu A'lam how many years. There are multiple hadith and ayat that talk about the number of years people are waiting. And even the time dimension we're talking about there is different than our time dimension now. The day wouldn't be like 24 hours of our time measurements. So people would try to beg Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People would say, Rabbi aqim as-sa'a. Everyone would say like, oh Allah, please, like just, we need to start. Even sometimes some hadiths say the day of judgment will be very long, that people would hope, would wish that the day of judgment is over, even if they're going to the hellfire. Imagine someone, he is okay with being put in the hellfire because he or she is so tired and so scared and so he gave up or she gave up completely that he or she might be saved from the adab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So after the gathering, and now the day of judgment is just about to start, now the first major test would come, which is the basin or the hawd of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet sallallahu mentioned the hawd in so many different hadith. That's why these hadith, you reach at the level that we call at-tawatur. In the hadith terminology, we have hadith mutawatir and hadith ahad. Mutawatir means hadith that is uniformly transmitted with so many different chain of narrators. So it reaches a very high level of authenticity that we are 100% sure that this hadith is authentic, and we have to believe in this hadith. While some other hadith would be narrated by single chains of narrators, that they are still authentic, but they're not in the same level. The difference between both are authentic, both we believe in them. The difference is the first one might add to your aqidah, which means if you deny one of the things of a mutawatir hadith, that might cause you a kind of a kufr, because it is something that is agreed upon, something that all Muslims agreed upon. So there's the difference. So some very details or practices of Islam were transmitted to us through ahad. That doesn't mean they're wrong, but it means there is a level of interpretation. How did we understand these rulings? But if there is something that is being transmitted through a numerous number of chains of narrators and scholars, that means it's 100% true, and there is no room of ijtihad. There is no room that we can deny this. One of these things is the hawd of the Prophet ﷺ. Why? So many different hadith are telling us that there will be a hawd, which literally means a pool of water for the Prophet ﷺ. And all of the hadith are describing the hawd are very beautiful. One of them, he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, hawdi masiratu shahr. He's describing how big the basin or the hawd will be. He said, my basin is as wide and broad that it requires a month's journey to go around it, or just to cross this hawd of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And he said, وَزَوَايَاهُ سَوَاء. And all the sides of the hawd or that basin are equal in terms of the size. وَمَاؤُهُ أَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْوَرِقِ. The water, the color of the water of this hawd is whiter than silver. وَرِيحُهُ أَطْيَبُ مِنَ الْمِسْكِ. The smell of this hawd is better than the musk. وَكِيزَانُهُ كَنُجُومِ السَّمَاءِ. The cups that you would use to drink from this hawd are like the stars in the sky. And then he said, which is the most important thing for us, فَمَنْ شَرِبَ مِنْهُ لَا يَظْمَأُ بَعْدَهُ أَبَدًا. Once you drink from this hawd, you will never feel thirsty afterwards, because it's the hawd of the Prophet ﷺ. But this is not the problem. The problem is not everyone qualifies for this privilege of drinking from the hawd. He said ﷺ in a hadith, إِنِّي عَلَى الْحَوْضِ حَتَّى أَنظُرَ مَنْ يَرِدُ عَلَيَّ مِنْكُمْ. Imagine the situation that we're just done with the gathering and now the day of judgment is starting, and then you see from a far distance the Prophet ﷺ is standing in front of his hawd, and he's waiting and he's looking at us, trying to look for the people from his followers. And he's trying to call us and invite us to the hawd. He said, I'm looking around trying to look for people, and he would know the people from his ummah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He said, I'm waiting for you, I want to receive you to come to this hawd. But the problem is, he said, وَسَيُؤْخَذُ أُنَاسٌ دُونِي. Some people, they are trying to come to me to the hawd, but they will be prevented. They will be taken away from the hawd. So I would try to talk to Allah and say, فَأَقُولُ يَا رَبِّ أُمَّتِي. I would say, oh Allah, those are my followers, those are part of my ummah. فَيُقَالُ أَمَا شَعَرْتَ مَا عَمِلُوا بَعْدَكَ. You didn't know what they did after you? وَاللَّهِ مَا بَرَحُوا بَعْدَكَ يَرْجِعُونَ عَلَىٰ أَعْقَابِهِمْ. That this call that would come to the Prophet ﷺ would say, by Allah, they didn't do good after you, and they turned back upon their heels, which is an Arabic expression that means a person who completely shifts or changes the ahd or the way that he or she used to live. But what we know from him ﷺ is that it's not going to be only one hawd, by the way. There's not only one basin or hawd. every prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have his own pool of water or his own basin. So it is not something unique to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because he said in the hadith, إِنَّ لِكُلِّ نَبِيٍّ حَوْضًا. Every prophet would have a basin on the Day of Judgment. وَإِنَّهُمْ يَتَبَاهُونَ أَيُّهُمْ أَكْثَرُ وَارِدَةً. They will be bragging, the prophets will be bragging on the Day of Judgment, who has the biggest number of people coming to his hawd. And then he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَإِنِّي أَرْجُو أَنْ أَكُونَ أَكْثَرَهُمْ وَارِدَةً. He said, I hope that mine will be the one with the most arrival of people coming to the hawd of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So if you drink from this hawd, you will never feel thirsty afterwards. That's why, by the way, drinking in Jannah, it is not because you're thirsty. It's just because you want to enjoy the water. Because there is no thirst in Jannah. The feeling of thirst that you feel in this life, you will never feel again when you get in Jannah. الشرب في الجنة على سبيل التلذذ. You're just drinking for the enjoyment of the taste of the water in Jannah. You're not drinking because you're just thirsty and you felt like drinking as we feel in this life. So not everybody will be admitted to the hawd of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Whoever changes his or her, as the Quran calls it, the covenant of faith. Whoever introduces a bid'ah in Islam, whoever deviates from the path of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would be prevented from the hawd of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then after the hawd, number 3 would come the shafa'ah, the intercession. And again, there is a minor shafa'ah and there is a major shafa'ah. There is a minor intercession and a major one. The minor one is us. We can offer shafa'ah for each other, depends on what you did in your life. Like the shaheed, for example, can offer shafa'ah for his family. Sometimes the people of Quran, they can offer shafa'ah for the families. Or if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants you this privilege for some of your families or friends in your life, you might be able to do this. And then there is the major shafa'ah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for his ummah. And he promised us that he would keep his major dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him a dua that will be absolutely accepted. So he preserved this dua for the Day of Judgment for us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He didn't have this dua in his life. And there's a beautiful ayah in Surah Al-Duha that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْطِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى. And your Lord will give you until you'll be satisfied. So one of the Sahaba, he commented and he said, the Prophet ﷺ would never be satisfied and one single person from his ummah is in the hellfire. He said, it's that great hope that we hope in him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Allah promised him that you will be satisfied and he will never be satisfied and one of his ummah in the hellfire, because he said something similar to this, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, La arda wahidun min ummati fi nar. And that was a beautiful promise and a glad tidings from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And after his shafa'ah will be the presentation of the actions or the deeds. يُنَبَّأُ الْإِنسَانُ يَوْمَئِذٍ بِمَا قَدَّمَ وَأَخَّرَ. A person would be given or presented or shown whatever he has done in his or her life. And then after that, after ardul a'mal, or the presentation of the deeds, will be the hisab, or the reckoning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the questions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the actual definition of hisab is توقيف الله العبادة في المحشر على أعمالهم وأفعالهم واعتقاداتهم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would literally stop his slaves in the land of gathering to be reckoned for their actions, for their aqwal, for their sayings and utterances, and even their beliefs in detail. Even your beliefs would be exposed and you would be asked about. Your sayings, every single thing you say in your life, you'll be presented, you'll be held accountable for. That's why the major destruction of deeds is our tongues. This is the most dangerous problem that we're having in our spirituality or religious practicing. And the Prophet ﷺ said that to the Sahaba. He said, nothing else would topple people down on their faces in the hellfire than what they reap from the words of their mouths. وَهَلْ يَكُبُّ النَّاسَ فِي النَّارِ عَلَى وُجُوهِهِمْ إِلَّا حَصَائِدُ أَلْسِنَتِهِمْ. When the Sahabi implied that, okay, why? Because the Sahabi asked for advice and the Prophet ﷺ told him, like, be aware of this. And he pointed out to his tongue. The Sahabi said, okay, sure, like, أَنُؤَخَذُ عَلَى كُلِّ مَا نَقُولُ. He said, like, are we really going to be asked about every single thing we say? So he got angry, the Prophet ﷺ. He said, there is actually nothing else would cause you to be in the depth of the hellfire except your tongue. He said, this is your major problem. This is the main problem. And he said that the person would say a word, heedless of it. He's not paying attention to this word. يَحْوِي بِهَا فِي النَّارِ 70 خَرِيفٍ. this word would cause him to be thrown in the hellfire for 70 years. Just because of a word. So imagine every day of your life how many words you're just uttering and saying, and you've never paid attention to these words. Imagine if you can see in front of you the consequences of your words. How many words you would say a day? If you can think of the consequences of every single thing you say, if you can see, and we cannot see in this life, if you can see actually the consequences of your deeds, what is going to happen because of all these words that you are saying day and night. This is what the Prophet ﷺ said, and this is what the definition of hisab says, that you would be held accountable for all the things. Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Umar said that a believer would be brought close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reassure the believer and envelop him with His mercy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bring, inshallah, us close, and then would like calm us down a little bit. And then ثُمَّ يُقَرِّرُهُ بِذُنُوبِهِ. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would ask this person and make him confess his sins. And Allah would ask the person, أَتَعْرِفُ ذَنْبَكَ ذَا? You remember that day when you did this sin? So the person, of course you have no choice at that time. The person would say, yes, I know. أعرف. Like, you have no other choice other than admitting. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell you, inshallah, hopefully, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell you, I have covered you in your life. No one knew about this. I have covered you this life. سَتَرْتُهَا عَلَيْكَ فِي الدُّنْيَا. And today I'm forgiving you for this sin. And then this person would be given the records of his hasanat. فَيُعْطَى صَحِيفَةُ أو صَحَائِفُ حَسَنَاتِهِ. This is one scenario. But the other scenario is that a caller would shout out loudly, talking about the actions and the deeds you did. فَيُنَادَى عَلَى رُؤُوسِ الْأَشْهَادِ, as the hadith says, like in front of everybody, everyone would actually hear the malak or the angel of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when he's saying, أُولَٰئِكَ أَوْ هَؤُلَاءِ الَّذِينَ كَذَبُوا عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ. Those are the ones who lied to the Lord. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran. When you are reckoned or held accountable on the day of judgment, it might happen from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it might happen from the angels. And you do not get to choose. It might happen from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it might happen from the angels. Which one of the two you would hope for? If you have a choice, would you prefer that Allah is the one who is holding the hisab with you, or one of the angels of Allah? Yes?
Allah.
Why?
He would be more merciful than the angel he has put to do the job.
Because the angel is just going to do it by book, right? Whatever he's commanded to do by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But subhanAllah, this is our nature. So this is the answer, the right answer actually, because our nature is that we are always hopeful in the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even until the last moment, even on the day of judgment, there will be still people trying to hope for the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, there's that beautiful hadith that the Prophet said it and he smiled about this person that once he knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaced his bad deeds with good deeds, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed him all the bad deeds he did. And then he said, like, okay, I've forgiven you and I will replace all of your bad deeds with good deeds. So this person, I look at the nature of human beings, out of his happiness, he would say, Allah, there are other deeds, other bad deeds I did that the angels actually didn't write down. He would actually try to, like, there are other things actually that I didn't find here. And of course, he's lying because everything is recorded. But because of how much mercy and benevolence he's witnessing and seeing, he's still longing for more. And this is the beautiful thing about most of the hadith about the day of judgment. You find a hadith that gives you mercy and hope to an unlimited extent about the forgiveness and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you find a hadith that are very scary, that you would think every single person will be in the hellfire. Even in the Quran, almost the same thing. Because you need to be always in this struggle with the balance between both. That's why we always talk about hope and fear. Al-khawf wal-raja. All the time. They are the two wings of the bird that you always need in your life. You'll be feared and then you'll be hopeful in the fadl and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the hisab may be from Allah, may be from the angels of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It may be from both, Allahu a'lam. But we have different ways of the hisab. Quran says hisabun yasir, hisabun asir. Easy reckoning and hard reckoning. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would hold you accountable for whatever you did according to the records of your deeds, and that's it. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would show more mercy on you and would, like, you're not going to be punished or rewarded exactly as in those records, but you might have more of His reward and mercy subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran says, فَأَمَّا مَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ بِيَمِينِهِ, and you would know the sign in the way you receive your books of records. So the Quran says the one who is receiving his book of records by his right hand, فَأَمَّا مَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ بِيَمِينِهِ فَسَوْفَ يُحَاسَبُ حِسَابًا يَسِيرًا. He will be judged with an easy account. وَيَنْقَلِبُ إِلَى أَهْلِهِ مَسْرُورًا, and return to his people in happiness. He would go back to the people of Jannah and he's so happy with the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the other one, some ayat says he's receiving his book of records by his left hand. Some ayat say from behind his back. وَأَمَّا مَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ وَرَاءَ ظَهْرِهِ, the one who's given his record behind his back. فَسَوْفَ يَدْعُو ثُبُورًا, he will cry out for destruction. وَيَصْلَى سَعِيرًا, and enter to burn in a blazing hellfire. And then the Quran would say, look at the contrast between the scenario and the first one. إِنَّهُ كَانَ فِي أَهْلِهِ مَسْرُورًا, he had once been among his people happy. So look at the contrast between the happiness on this day for the first person and the happiness in this life that might not give you happiness on the day of judgment. Because the surah uses the same word of happiness, but the first one, after this person achieves his major goal, which is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, now this is the true happiness. But this person, the other one who's going to be in a blazing hellfire, he was happy before, but in his fake happiness in this life. That's why this human objective of pursuit of happiness that we always talk about, it is not an ultimate happiness. There is no a certain point of your life that you will be ultimately happy. This doesn't happen. It never happened before, it doesn't happen now, it's not going to happen in the future. Sorry to be pessimistic, but this is the reality. Right? There's no this. Sometimes we have these, subhanAllah, people just want to go for whatever fake reliefs. That, okay, yeah, they will come. Once I graduate, I'm going to be happy. Once I get married, I'm going to be happy. Once I do this, I'm going to be happy. You always put these minuses of your life, and you think there's that point that you would never feel stressed, or you would never feel anxious, or you'd never feel worried about anything. This point will not come, right? Just you believe it or not. I'm not saying there's no happiness in this life. There is. And there's pleasure in this life. And there are blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this life. But they're always limited. They're always restricted. They're always coming to you as a limited blessing or a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's always something behind things that are happening to you. So thinking that there is a point of time that would come and everything would be good, this is not the nature of this life. If you understand this life this way, so I don't think you're getting it right. Because the way you understand is that you're not here to enjoy yourself. Right? You're not living this life to enjoy yourself. And again, I'm talking about it in the very abstract. I'm not saying there's no kind of happiness or enjoyment in this life. There is. But the ultimate happiness or enjoyment, it is not actually in this life. It is not a certain point that you achieve and that's it. Full stop, I've done all what it takes to be happy. This is not going to happen. It's actually the happiness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about this person when he or she receives the book of records by the right hands, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admits them in the Jannah. While the other one, he was always in his or her fake happiness in this life. إِنَّهُ كَانَ فِي أَهْلِهِ مَسْرُورًا. Why he was happy? Because the following ayah says it, إِنَّهُ ظَنَّ أَنْ لَا يَحُورَ, because he used to think he will never be returned back. This is the reason, that he was in that fake happiness. And then Allah says, بَلَا إِنَّ رَبَّهُ كَانَ بِهِ بَصِيرًا. Indeed, his Lord was over him seeing. And then everyone will be in the same time held accountable in that hisab, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing it to all of us in the same time, and everyone would think he's the only one who's been asked. So you do not think much that, how can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask all millions of people in the same time? You never know, Allahu a'lam, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so you just stop there. But the feeling that you would have at that point is that you think that you're the only person who's been asked and addressed by the khitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then again, as we go through all these things, there are always exemptions and exceptions. So there are people who will be exempted from the hisab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And some of them are, of course, the prophets. And they said on top of those people after the Prophet is Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. And it's interesting that in every single stage we mention Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Starting from the grave, to the questions of the angels, to the hisab, to the hashr, to all these things, he's always there at the top of the list of people who are exempt from the khawf or the fear on this day. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised him that 70,000 people of his ummah will enter the Jannah without hisab. 70,000 of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ would enter the Jannah with no reckoning or hisab from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he said, with every 70,000, with every 1,000 of the 70, another 70,000. So you multiply 70,000 by 70,000 of the people of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ that will not, or that will enter Jannah without hisab from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So 70,000 by 70,000, and it's not just that. At the end of the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, وَثَلَاثُ حَثَيَاتٍ مِنْ حَثَيَاتِ رَبِّي. And plus the 70,000 by 70,000, there are 3 handfuls of my Lord. So he left it open. We didn't know the number. And this is the beautiful thing about some ahadith that are talking about reward in terms of numbers. You will find always something that refers to an unlimited number of the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these ayat are talking about the hisab. So many different ayat are talking about the hisab. But there is an ayah, very interesting ayah in Surah Al-Rahman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَيَوْمَئِذٍ لَا يُسْأَلُ عَنْ ذَنْبِهِ إِنسٌ وَلَا جَانٌ. He said, on that day, no one will be asked about his sin among men or jinn. So this ayah kind of negates the other ayat that are talking about the hisab. So again, you have to understand all the ayats of the Quran together. You put them all together in the same context to understand them. And some scholars said the ayah means after people are admitted in the hellfire, you will not be asked about their sins anymore because it's over. So there is no negation or contradiction between this ayah and the rest of the ayat that are talking about the hisab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After you've done your hisab, here comes the mizan, the scale. And it's an actual real scale. When you see this word in the Quran and the Sunnah, it's not a metaphorical word that implies justice, for example. No, it's an actual scale. Mizan al-haqiqi. Ala surati mizan al-dunya. It's going to be actually in the shape of the scales that we see in this life. Like that has the 2 sides, and you put the things in both sides and you see how it's going to weigh. It's the same style that we understand of this life. The size, the shape, all these things, of course, we don't know. But the concept of a scale, as we know, is going to be almost the same concept on the Day of Judgment. And it's going to be one scale for all people. Okay, but how about this ayah in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and we place the scales of justice, al-mawazin, نضع الموازين القسط ليوم القيامة. So the plural word in this ayah doesn't mean there will be multiple scales. It means that sometimes in Arabic language we use the plural to glorify the thing that you're talking about. You know, as in the pronouns, you use the royal we sometimes, and it refers to one person. It's the same concept. So mawazin here still talks about one scale, one mizan, yawm al-qiyamah. And then your actions would be shaped in a certain way. And will be put in that scale. On one side the good deeds, and the other side the bad deeds. And Allah says in the surah, فَأَمَّا مَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ فَهُوَ فِي عِيشَةٍ رَاضِيَةٍ. The one whose scales are heavy with good deeds, he will be in a pleasant life. وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَفَّتْ مَوَازِينُهُ. The opposite, the one whose scales are light, his refuge will be of no avail or value. فَأُمُّهُ هَاوِيَةٌ. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا هِيَ. You didn't know, you will never know what the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. And then some people will be also exempted from the test of the scale. And then after all of that comes the sirat, the bridge that will be between this place that you were at. You're still in that place of mawqif, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is holding all these things from the hisab and the mizan and the hawd and all these things. Then now you're almost there on the bridge. You need to cross. So you're crossing above the hellfire. So you whether fall, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, in the hellfire, or you make it to the other side. And this almost, again, according to this narrative we went for, it's almost the last step before the Jannah or the Nar. So it's a bridge, it's a sirat, which means a path or a kind of a bridge. And the Prophet ﷺ said, يُضْرَبُ الصِّرَاطُ بَيْنَ ظَهْرَانَيْ جَهَنَّمْ. Said the sirat, or the path or the bridge, will be laid across hell. فأكون أنا وأمتي أول من يجوزه أو أول من يجوزه. Said, I and my ummah will be the first to cross over this bridge. And there are multiple traditions about the description of this bridge. Some scholars said it's very thin, like a hair, like one single hair. And you are requested to walk and cross above this hair. And it's very sharp, like the sword. This is the famous description of the sirat. And some other scholars said it depends on your actions and your state, would be the width of the sirat that you are walking on. And that's why the people who are crossing over this path or sirat will be different. Some of them will survive and will make it to the other side, and some of them will not. And even those who will survive and make it to the other side, they are different. Some people would cross the sirat like a blink of an eye. كلمح البصر. They literally like less than a second, and those people already had made it to the other side. Some people would cross the sirat like the blowing wind, as the Prophet ﷺ said. Some people would fly, crossing this sirat. Some people would cross as if they are riding horses. Karakib al-Jawad, they are running with their horses. Some people would be running actually on their feet above the sirat. Some people would be walking. And some people would be actually even less than walking. So they're almost falling. They're not sure if they can actually keep their balance to cross the sirat. Some people would fall and would never come back. And some people would fall and then would come back trying to cross again. And they would fall again and they would come back. For how many times? Allahu A'lam. All of that again obviously dependent on whatever you have done in your life. Some scholars mentioned something beautiful about sirat. They said some tip, if you take care of in your life, your crossing of the sirat will be so easy. They said, always shaitan comes to you and tries to insinuate or to whisper to you something that he wants you to do. And then we react to this differently. Sometimes we take our time thinking about the ma'asiyah. And then we decide to do it or we decide not to do it. So we're not talking about a person who already did the ma'asiyah. Of course he did the ma'asiyah, that's it. Khalas, he did a sin. We're talking about the people who think about the ma'asiyah and then they do not do it. So we're talking about a bit of a higher level, right? So the people in that period of thinking about should I do it or not are different as well. Sometimes it takes you 1 second and you say, A'udhu Billah, and that's it. Right? Like shaitan tells you to do something, to whatever the ma'asiyah is, whatever the sin is. So it takes you 1 or 2 seconds, and then right away you turn the shaitan away, and like A'udhu Billah minash shaitanir rajeem, you try to change your mood, you try to do something else, you make dhikr, whatever you would do to just like push away this evil thought in your mind. Some other people would take time, they are struggling, they are trying. They're inshallah sincere, but they're trying, they're taking time trying to overcome the thoughts of the shaitan. So some scholars said, the faster you are turning the shaitan away when these thoughts come to you, the faster your crossing on the bridge will be. If you are pushing away the thought of the ma'asiyah, we're not talking about if you committed the ma'asiyah, you didn't commit it either way in this situation. But the faster I look at, and we always should aim for higher levels spiritually. We shouldn't just like aim for the minimum. We shouldn't just like, okay, I just want to make it. No, you should actually, the Prophet ﷺ always teaches us this. That when even you make dua, even if you think you're messed up, as we say, even if you're making dua, ask for the firdaus. Ask for the highest level of the Jannah. Don't say, okay, like, I'm not a person that would be in the firdaus, in the highest level of the Jannah. It is not your business. Just like make the dua. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. And it's something very weird for these people who think, I'm not going to make dua for this because I don't think I deserve it. It is not you who decides on this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forgiven people who were much worse than you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has caused people to embrace Islam and to die a couple minutes afterwards. And we all know these stories, but when it comes to ourselves, we just like don't think we fit for this or we actually qualify for this. You will never measure the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This person who killed 99 persons, and he still was looking for an advice. He didn't even finish his tawbah yet. And he has this person, he gave him a wrong advice. And you know the story, and he killed him. So he killed 100 people. And then that person told him, like, just go to another, just change your environment and you'll be good. That was the brilliant advice he gave him. So on his way to that new environment or village or city next to him, he died. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admitted him in the Jannah because of this. So when you think of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, do not be very limited to our limited perceptions of mercy. You read this hadith, at the same time read the hadith that a woman would be in the hellfire because she mistreated her cat. Right? And we don't know if anything else this woman did in her life. We don't know if really she was a good man or a good woman or not. And we don't care if she was, because the point is you never underestimate any actions or any deeds. And the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تحقرن من المعروف شيئا. Don't ever belittle any kind of ma'ruf, any kind of good deed you do. Maybe what you think would give you survival on the Day of Judgment with all these actions, prayers or sadaqah, whatever you do, maybe all these things wouldn't actually count for you. And maybe one very simple little situation you did once, and you really had a high mark of sincerity in this situation, this is what would give you survival on the Day of Judgment. You never know. So when you ask for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, do not ask or think of this mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your own measurements of understanding of His mercy or of His punishment. Always assume husnul dhan with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask Him, even if you're doing bad. Of course, you shouldn't feel shy about what you're doing, but at the same time, when you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ask Him for the highest levels of sincerity and the highest levels of mercy and forgiveness, inshallah, in the Jannah. And then after people make it to the other side, will be the last admission to the Jannah or the Nar. We call it in Arabic Jannah and Nar, or the paradise and the hellfire. And the word Nar, the definition of Nar or fire in Islam is Darul Iqab, is the place of punishment. It's not only fire, because not all the kinds of punishment of hellfire is just a person being burned. There are so many different, unlimited number of kinds of punishments. And it's 7 levels. 7 levels in the hellfire. The one on top is for the sinners of Muslims, the people who believed in Allah, but they were sinning. So these people will be punished for a certain period of time. We don't know how long, but they will be punished, and hopefully at the end, you'll be taken out from the hellfire. So they are on the top. And once all Muslims or all people who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are being punished and refined and cleansed from the sins they've done, you'll be taken out from the hellfire, you'll be admitted to Jannah. And this level of the hellfire will be closed, will be completely destructed and closed. Because it's only for the people who believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then you go down and down for other 6 levels that are, of course, much worse in terms of the punishment. And the Quran has multiple names. As-Sa'ir, Al-Hutama, Lada. There's too many different names that are all very scary names. And of course, they all entail this unimaginable level of punishment and pain. And those 7 levels, the door of each is from the one before it. Which means if a person, may Allah save all of us, will be admitted in the 7th level of the hellfire, he has to go through all of it. He's not going to go right away to the 7th as a start from the beginning. So he has or she has to pass through all the 7 levels of the hellfire. Because there's only one axis, and to get to the axis, you have to go through the one before it. This is the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defined it. And the fuel, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, of the hellfire are not wood and gas. It's actually people would be the fuel of the hellfire. And the stones, as the Quran says, وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَ. The fuel of the fire will be people themselves. And the rocks, or the stones, which means the stones that those people used to worship besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They would see their fake gods they used to worship being the fuel in the hellfire. This is the fire. And then Al-Jannah, which literally means Al-Bustan, which means the garden. That's why the Quran says about this person who owns an actual garden in this life. وَدَخَلَ جَنَّتَهُ وَهُوَ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. He entered his garden, his Jannah, while he was unjust to himself. And if An-Nar is the place of punishment, this one is the place of reward. Darul Iqab wa Darul Al-Thawab. And according to some scholars, there are 7 paradises or Jannahs. The highest one is the Firdaus, which I just said about the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that you should aim for, which is the highest level. It's right beneath the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And from this first one, the main rivers of the Jannah would be gushing forth from there. And Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, which is actually the common opinion in the tafsir, is that there are only 4 different Jannahs, not 7. And they got this from Surah Al-Rahman. Because in Surah Al-Rahman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ جَنَّتَانِ. For everyone who fears the position of his or her Lord, he will be granted 2 Jannahs or 2 different paradises. And then few ayahs later, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says again, وَمِن دُونِهِمَا جَنَّتَانِ, and from underneath these 2 above, there will be 2 other paradises. So they said the total is 4 Jannahs, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. And some other scholars said it's only 1 Jannah, but all those are just different names of the same thing. But what we know, the kind of consensus that we have is that there are different levels in the Jannah. Whether it's 1 or 7 or 4, less or more, at the end of the day, there are levels of the Jannah. We're not going to be in the same level in the Jannah. The Quran, of course, talks about Jannah in so many different ayat, and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which would be, inshallah, the last class next week, talk about the description of the Jannah, description of the Nar. How would we experience, inshallah, only Jannah, not both. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to save us, inshallah, from the hellfire. So before I conclude, I just want to let you know that just for a family emergency, I will have to travel, so I'm not going to be here next week. So inshallah, Sheikh Muhammad Mahmoud will be given the last session. Instead of me, will be covering the last part of the class next week, inshallah, at the same time, same place, and he'll be covering this last part of the description of the Jannah and description of the Nar, inshallah, and that will be the conclusion of this class. Inshallah, hopefully soon we'll start another class, inshallah, and we'll let you know about the new class. And please feel free if you have any suggestions, if you have any feedback, if you have any requests that you want from me, from myself, from the team, from Al-Majlis, from the MSA, please try to reach out to us. If you have suggestions or feedback about the next topics that, inshallah, we are going to cover for the next course, hopefully soon, inshallah, please reach out to us here or through the email, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless all of you, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to save us from the hellfire and to grant us the Jannah. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم. السلام عليكم.